Reason. A very powerful, powerful thing. You know, in Unitarian Universalism, we have the 7 principles, and we talk about that a lot. And then we have 6 sources, and our sources are the various world religious traditions, the Judeo-Christian tradition, and also the guidance of reason that humanists encourage us to pay attention to avoid the idolatries that tend to happen when we get attached, as I so appreciate Ruth selected our reading today, when we get attached to a particular set of beliefs or a particular set of understandings about how things are and have to be, they become our idols. And that doesn't work very well. And so part of being a Unitarian Universalist in this culture is to question and to allow a different form of knowing. The concept of pure reason was part of that period that led to the formation of the United States. You know, last time I was here, it was called 1776 at the beginning of the month because it was honoring what was going on the 4th of July. Well, in 1781, Immanuel Kant published a critique of pure reason. It was part of that same period in Western thought of trying to get beyond accepting what someone else tells us must be true and to begin to discover a deeper, more complete truth within us. But the word reason that is being used by Kant and later Emerson and a few others is not what we have been taught it means. Because probably when you were in 2nd and 3rd grade and 5th grade and 6th grade and you were working your mathematics, someone would say, now reason it out. And they would say, now take this step, and then one more step, and then one more step, and one more. No, that is not reason. That is linear, analytical thinking. And that is exactly what they didn't want us to do when they were encouraging us to rely on capital R, reason. Okay? So I want to pull up a couple of things. If we look at the definition of reason, it's got a lot of different meanings, okay? You know, one of them is to argue with and try to persuade. Well, I reasoned with him, but he didn't come around to my way of thinking. Okay? And that gets us to, someone being unreasonable, right? They're not following what we think it ought to be, right? Isn't that interesting? Or the basis, or the cause, or the reason for doing something, or as one definition put it, a statement offered in justification for an action taken. And in that dictionary it said, as in a war. We have a reason, which is actually a justification. All right? And then finally, what we get is that capacity for consciously making sense of things. For making sense of things, establishing and verifying what is true for us. Okay? So, if we look at all these different ways we use the word, I have to tell you, Kant wouldn't have used any of them. He would have bordered on one of them. Okay? What has happened, as often happens with English, and you've heard me, some of you have heard me say many times, if you trace what it was originally intended to mean, all the way through to how we're using it today, there's often a very big gap, a huge difference. So, when Kant was using reason, what he was trying to help us to get was that there are certain, what he would call a priori, there are certain things that you simply know from your deep inner sense of knowing, that you don't have to rely on anyone out there to give you insight about or explain. And you don't have to rely on the evidences of your senses. Okay? Some of us simply know things about ourselves, or know things about others, or we know that life is interconnected. We didn't need to be told that. We can feel that. We know that. So these are the kinds of things that Kant was saying are a priori. They come from the beginning. And then there are things that come from our senses and come from what people tell us. Okay? And these are the things that we have been trained to believe, or have learned in school, or we've had experiences. We've said, well, I had this experience, and then this experience, and this experience, so this must be how things are. Right? And these are what he would have referred to as a posteriori, things that come from behind or come afterwards. So this thing that happened, this way of thinking, Kant had been developing for like 12 years. So the time that the revolution was emerging in this country, in the way that we interacted as a community, he was developing what felt to him like the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Because he was saying, let's turn it upside down. Let's not rely on the evidence of our senses for what is true. Let us rely on that deep inner knowing for what is true. A few years later, Coleridge came up with some other interesting things, and he published a book that was the Aids to Reflection in 1829. Now, 1829 is when Ralph Waldo Emerson got married and became actively ministering at the Second Church in Boston. And so he was very impressed with this piece of work. Aids to Reflection. And what Coleridge did is he said, well, let's take a look at this and let's say that stuff that Kant was talking about, that we already know, we know from deep inside, that's reason with a capital R. And the stuff that we get from the world around us, that's just our understanding. So that's an interesting thing. And Emerson picked up on that, and it really guided a lot of his thinking over the next several years. And in fact, when he did go to Europe in 32, 33, it was in part to meet with Coleridge and to have conversations about this idea of the difference between capital R reason, that deep inner knowing, and capital U understanding, that which we derive from the world around us. Now, those of you who have been in the Course in Miracles classes are aware that this is a distinction that's presented in the Course in Miracles as well. That which comes through our perceptions, the Course calls ego. That which comes from our deeper knowing, the Course calls our true selves, or spirit, the voice of spirit working in our lives. So it's a very similar model coming from very different directions. And I kind of like that. For me, that helps me get that maybe that's pretty accurate when it comes from a lot of different directions. So Emerson turned from what was the norm of Puritan New England, the revelation, to reason. He said, let's not look at other people's ideas of what is as presented to us as revelation, but let's go from what we know from deep inside. So the essay Self-Reliance, it's not rely on what you can do as a body, it's rely on that inner self that has that deeper knowing and can guide us. Don't rely on what the world out there is saying, rely on that deeper knowing and move with it and act from it. And he said when you do that, then the whole world begins to be realigned and shift and change in alignment with you. We had two incredible beings pass from this world onto the next over this last week, and both of them were living what I'm talking about in many, many ways. It was they were both very powerful examples of living from the inside, from what they knew to be true inside, yes, and not from what the world told them they should do and be. Such a wonderful gift they were. So as Emerson worked with this, what he began to realize was that there were many things that were expected in the churches of that time that he couldn't do anymore. He wasn't able to take the dogma, the doctrine, the leading by revelation that was coming at him and say that was going to be how he grew spiritually or how anyone else did. He stopped. And he was no longer an active minister after 1832. That was it. He occasionally spoke in churches, but he thought of himself as a poet philosopher. And he became known, as you all are probably aware, as the most well-read and the greatest lecturer in this country for that century as a result. So, and what he kept saying over and over and over again was find that space, that place, that knowing that is in each of us, and act from that. In one essay, he talks about how if someone gets up in front of us and only speaks from the head, we're not interested. The moment they speak from their heart, we connect. Yes. You know, and at a couple of times he would get up and he would say, you know, if you're interested in spiritual renewal, he said, go to someplace quiet in nature and allow the infinite all that is to speak through nature to your inner being, and then discover who you are in connection with all of that. Over and over again. Now, some of that got lost because one of the things that he knew was that certain of those dogmatic Christians heard what he was actually saying. They'd probably tar and feather him. So he buried a lot of this in some pretty intricate prose. I know some of you may recall trying to track a sentence that went on a page and a half, right? And you know, when I had been asked by a publishing company to take some of those essays and popularize them, and they published it in this book, and I'm going, oh, I'm not sure I can do that. You know, he really was trying to bury some of this stuff. And then there was a moment where, in his work, he says, you know, often that which is published is not published. But at another point he says, there will come a time in which all that has been hidden will be made known. And I felt like that gave me permission. So I went through and tried to give us some reasonably short sentences and paragraphs and some exercises about this. But the very first thing that he wrote was a little something he wrote anonymously. He wrote it when he came back from Europe. It was called Nature. Today it's considered one of his greatest essays. He published it anonymously as a little book. Okay? And my version. If we look at nature's work, we seem to catch a glimpse of a system in transition. The direction is always onward. Nature is always bringing materials from the past forward in their most advanced stage to form something new. It's a long way from granite to an oyster, and further yet to Plato preaching the immortality of the soul, yet all must emerge as nature unfolds her infinite variety. For Emerson, to experience, to allow oneself to experience the natural world was to allow oneself to become who we were born to become. In the world that he grew up in, we were static creatures. We didn't evolve, we didn't develop. It was not part of people's thinking. Darwin came along after Emerson had been lecturing for 20 years. All right? This was not a normal way of thinking. And he invited people to consider the possibility that they were developing and becoming ever more who they could become, to develop their full capacity as individuals. He's the one who said that, you know, unreasonable conformity is the hobgoblin of small minds. And for him, that term reason was equivalent to what many people at the time would have called God. He said in a letter to his brother in 1844, reason is the highest faculty of the soul, what we mean often by the soul itself. Reason never reasons, never proves, it is vision. Understanding toils all the time. It compares, it contrives, it adds, it argues, dwelling in the expedient, the customary. Beasts have some understanding, but no reason. Reason is potentially perfect in every human being. For him, reason, the universal mind, the Oversoul, and God were all the same thing. It was the source, the supply, the nurturing presence that guides us and encourages us and makes it possible for us to become who and what we really are. What he wanted us to get was that every action that we take, every word that we use, every statement that we make is potentially God made manifest in this world right now. Because we are that. And as we allow those thoughts, those words, those actions to come from the deepest place, we are who we were born to be. Thank you all for being the embodiment of reason. Bless you all.